multi-dimensions. I'm convinced of that, and my new newsletter has to do with that. I'm going to send that one to you as well. So all the symbolism is really referring to other dimensions as well as this one.
Right.
And it's the magic of the symbolism has to do with greater dimensionality, I believe. So, let's go back to this Herzog guy. He started with the dolly. I call it the game of turning it around, spelling it in Hebrew, turning it around. So we thought, because they told us, that COVID is some kind of acronym for a coronavirus disease, right?
Right.
But Herzog says, let's play the dolly game with it. So let's write COVID in Hebrew. First, let's write it in English and spell it backwards. So COVID would be D-I-V-O-C, Divock, right? Now let's translate that into Hebrew characters, where he points out V and B are denoted by the same character, and O and U are the same character. So now we get D-I-V-O-C becomes D-Y-B-U-K. Dibbuk. So that's what COVID really symbolically is. It's a dibbuk. The Israeli anthropologist Yoram Bilu says that possession by a dibbuk leaves the victim a passive object, bereft of self-awareness and without self-control. The Moderna CEO Stefan Bonsell told the whole world, he didn't hide it, that it's to hack the software of life. So it's a dibbuk introduced into the body. This is a transformational biotech dibbuk.
That's right. And the other thing I want to mention, Sofia, before the dibbuk and COVID-19, let's go back to COVID-19 for a second. COVID, and then 19, 1 plus 9 is 10. The number 10 is the number of completion and new beginnings. So when we take a look at what COVID means, when we look at it from a Hebrew perspective, spelling it backwards, and then we take the number of completion and new beginnings, that was telling me that they believe they are on a new form of humanity. When we talk about the whole aspect of transhumanism and all that stuff, right? We've been talking about that for years. So that's another piece I wanted to lay in there, is that even with their numbers, they are coding and telling us, hey, this is the new beginnings, and humanity is going to be very different going forward.
Right, and that's the alchemy.
Yeah.
The alchemical reconstruction of the world according not to natural law but to the will of man. That is Manly Hall. That's what he wrote about in that very seminal work of his. That alchemy wants to rebuild the world not by natural law but by man's will.
Right, and in a number of shows, in my commentary videos, I have mentioned to my audience that this is a battle of will. It's our will versus their will. And my will is to be a human and to have our connection back to spirit, whereas their will is they're going to play God.
Yeah.
And it's all about being the gods of the physical realm. That's the chasm that we have. This is why the two shall never meet, because there are two very, very different ideologies and philosophies on what life is all about.
Well, also, they want to bring in the archonic underworld. I think they want that to be a real open participant in our culture and daily life. And this is why you see those, skateboards with skulls on them and all of the hellish, gargoylish advertising artwork. And they are bringing that underworld into our world. That's what they want.
Exactly.
So I also started to think about other dibbuks. We've got dibbuks going all over the place, Mike. We've got the COVID dibbuk injected into most people now, or a lot of people. I don't know how many it is. But we've got dibbuks going on in our heads from our stupid phones.
Yes.
And I want to read a quote. I often refer to Harper's Magazine. It's a mainstream magazine. It's a little bit on the intellectual side, and I would say it's heavily liberal. But they do have some very interesting, they excerpt from things. They have their own reporters who write very long essays thousands of words. And I love that because sometimes the topic is fascinating and you can sit there and you can read page after page, really well written. So anyway, they have a columnist called, what is his name? Hari Kunzru. And he was reflecting on the internet. Now, Harper's is starting to contain quite a bit of observation about the downside of the internet. And they never go where you and I and our pals would go. They don't go that deep. But so this guy wrote in the Easy Chair column, this was in July 2021, the internet has destroyed our ability to concentrate, condemning us to a future of agitated doom scrolling. Our alienated children stare at their screens, poking at buttons like lab rats, barely able to comprehend the polychrome sewage flashing before their red-rimmed eyes. Our attention, once a tool of exquisite interiority, has been shattered by the excessive stimulation of the modern world, leaving us prey to manias and phantoms. So the manias and phantoms are more Dybbuks, but this hijacking of our agency, our selfness, by our addiction to screens, he uses that term polychrome sewage. Our attention has gone from interiority to this polychrome sewage. Like, what next? What next? We have to be constantly fed more and more of this. And that's really sad.
And most of it, if not all of it, is inane. That's the thing.
Inane, yes. And you know what they're doing, Mike? It's hilarious because now they've actually coined the term deep attention. And they're saying in universities that it's hard for people to learn course material if it requires deep attention. Can you imagine? At an institution of higher learning, they're actually saying nobody can learn.
I see it all the time, Sophia. I see it like if I put documentaries up, that's some of the things I've been doing over the last year and a half, 2 years, is I would find certain documentaries and I would put them up on my video platforms. And these are important documentaries. These are videos that are going to give a perspective that you're never going to see in the mainstream media, ever. And what I find is most people, even people who consider themselves to be truth seekers and who are awake, do not have the attention span to be able to go through and watch and take in information that is intellectually stimulating and would help them to better critically think. Very few people that I have found have it within them to dig deep.
Yeah, and that's because, as I say, Dybbuks abound. You don't, in India, the young people are arguing that they shouldn't have to go to school to learn anything because they can just Google it.
Right.
I mean, now you can shout your queries. You're going to be able to think your queries once the chips are in your brain. And so then Google will give you the answer, but it's the wrong answer, right? It's the answer they want you to have, not the one you have found on your own. So this Dybbuk thing, it actually harks to something I read about, again, in Harper's. I have to say, I got to credit that thing for an awful lot of information. So the world's first electronic computer came out in 1946. And there was this mathematician at MIT at the time, Norbert Wiener. And I think he did some stuff for the Air Force. They were trying to figure out how they could predict where pilots and planes would be at any point and create a program that would be able to bomb out of the sky accurately. So he came up with a huge body of work, which basically was a book. 1950, this book came out, The Human Use of Human Beings. And it was this new field that argued that modern society operates through a series of information exchanges. So reporters and social scientists gather data. Intellectuals, business leaders, and politicians process that data. And then you can put that data into systems that then will in turn control the people. So computers, Wiener argued, could help improve the flow of information by supplying decision makers with better data faster. So now this transformed the engineers in our world into the new gods. And they would be the ones to design these new systems that would start controlling everything. So the laboratory scientists began to work with the social scientists, and they began to outline a world modeled and managed by computers. And this is known as cybernetics. So, in the old days, the human use of human beings was slavery. Today, it's data collection. This is another form of slavery. That was very clear to me when I realized, oh my God, the human use of human beings is slavery. We're becoming slaves to these debbucks.
We are. And let me just add this. When I was in the corporate world, one of the catchphrases that was used all the time was data is everything. And, back in the day when people heard that, I don't think they really understood what it really meant. What it meant was the more data that you have, the more you can control. Mm-hmm. Or at least you think you can control. So, in other words, as an example, I think we mentioned this going back, a couple of years ago. I mentioned about business analytics in the corporate world. Well, business analytics was based upon enormous amounts of data input, and then they would use computers, computation, AI, in order to determine what a client needed before a client knew that they needed it, right? So that's a mechanism of steering.
Yes.
Steering behavior. The person that you're going to present to has no idea that they want this at the time that you're meeting them, but after you get done presenting based upon all of the data that you've compiled, you've now convinced them that, hey, you're right, I do need this. And it just changes the mindset and moves them in a certain direction. I'm talking about the client. So this concept of what you're just talking about, data and being a slave to it, is absolutely true.
Yeah, and that, Mike, is alchemy. When you can turn the world in another direction, that's alchemy.
It is. And when people talk about magic, sometimes they think it's just, rituals and incantations and stuff like that. But a big part of alchemy is to be able to get what you want by pursuing your will, which includes being able to alter the thoughts and the consciousness of those that you're looking to extract or to get from or to steer. So from a magician's perspective and from an alchemic perspective, it is the manipulation of thought and consciousness to be able to get what it is you want. I hope that made sense.
Yes, that's the will of man.
Exactly.
Intention. And Mike, in a previous newsletter, I don't know if you managed to read that. I sent you a few of them, but I talked about the nanotech pyramid that I mentioned in a very early talk. It was my Chemtrails to Pseudo-Life. I think it was the part 1, which was 2011. The nanotech pyramid is just a layering of how nanotechnology works. You could say its intention, its design, its overall design in the material world. So you start with basic materials that are then assembled, and they can self-assemble. They have this encoded into them, into structures. Then those structures follow certain processes. The entirety of all of that, the structures and the processes, create devices. So material structures, processes, and devices. And this is what is being found. They are finding materials that they call undisclosed or undeclared components. These materials self-assemble into more complex structures. These materials appear to be following processes. Some people call it self-awareness. Some people call it it's following its own kind of intelligence.
Right.
And you are getting also things that look like circuit boards. These are called nanoarrays. These are the devices of nanotechnology. And basically, that word nanoarray, that term translates to sensor. This is an artificial sensor. It's a machine. And what is that but AI working inside you in the form of a device or machine? All over the world, scientists, experts started to identify and comment on these very mysterious materials that are not disclosed. And nobody's discussing them in terms of, the authorities.
No, and in fact, Sofia, I'll go a step further and say that there are many people within the alternative research community that don't talk about it. And I think it's because for a lot of people, it's so far beyond their comprehension that this type of technology is available that I think a lot of people just chalk it up as lunatic fringe stuff, even though this technology exists, folks.
And Mike, I have to say that I began by gathering firsthand material from a lot of people suffering with this Morgellons syndrome.
Right.
And this goes back to 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
You and I did a show on it.
Yes. And these things, people were labeled, that they had delusions of parasitosis, that they were making stuff up, that they were inflicting these wounds upon themselves and claiming that, people had very sophisticated life forms coming out of their lesions, some of them, like bugs and whatnot, bits of bark.
Or pulling fibers out of their body.
Fibers. Fibers would be the materials, right? Some people were pulling structures. Some people were pulling little, that looked like squares, glinting, metallic, with inscriptions on them, letters and symbols. And they all bought microscopes, and they all started looking at the stuff. And they could feel pressure in these lesions. So that one of the things that typifies Morgellons is you develop these sores that don't close, and the sores emit not just this biofilm and goo, but they emit these things that want to come out of you. And the things are coming out in all different kinds of stages of assembly. And Mike, I'm sorry to say, but the stuff that I saw, it looks very much like all the stuff that was coming out of, and still coming out of the Morgellons people, who, by the way, are debilitated beyond belief right now. These things are moving around. They're flipping. They're doing all kinds of stuff. They're animate, right?
Right.
And Mike, the best word for this, electroparasites.
Yeah.
I
do have a question for you, though, Sofia. I don't want to digress here, but and if you don't have an opinion on this, just say, Mike, I don't have an opinion on this. Let's move on. But what is your take on the possibility that is a result of some kind of biological weapon that was released from a lab?
Mike, they have to have that as another storyline because
that's exactly what I said.
They've got to blame someone. This way they can blame the Chinese or blame the Russians or blame spies.
And it also has the effect of people believing that and then going off and because then they believe they are impervious to a bioagent.
That's right. Now, there are things that could be bioweapons. The scene is a bioweapon.
Exactly.
And the other thing I want to slip into this show, and then we can talk about it more in another show if you like. This thing is an integrated capstone event, a global one. That's how they're getting all these teams to participate in this kind of really extraordinary coordination. And Mike, I have tried to get this to the attention of some really big hosts and people like Stu Peters, who seems to have come out of nowhere. I don't know what the guy is all about. But I hear people saying all the time, well, how do they get Krispy Kreme to give away so many donuts? And how do they get celebrities to, wax on about the benefits? They're all being paid.
Right.
This is done with money that is borrowed, that is paid out by the international banks to get the world all on the same program.
Well, just to comment on Stu Peters, because sometimes I put Stu's videos up, and the reason why I do, because somebody asked me about that. I said, look, I don't think Stu is the sharpest knife in the drawer. In fact, he believes he's a lot smarter than he actually is as far as understanding how the world is controlled. But the reason why I put him up on my blog is because his guests are usually very good.
Yeah.
In spite of some of the questions he asks or the opinions that he renders in those videos, I'm focused more on his guests. So the reason why I'm bringing this up, Sofia, is because if you brought this to a Stu Peters, the whole capstone event perspective, he doesn't understand it. He doesn't have any idea what you're talking about.
If we laid it out for him, the thing is you have to have several years of perspective on all of this in order to understand that these are funded agendas.
Right, but you would have to sit down with him and, see Spot run. I
see, yes. You're probably right. This is very new thinking for a lot of these people.
I don't mean to beat up on him. It's just, you're right. He came out of nowhere. He does have a lot of good guests, but Like I said, he thinks he's a lot smarter than he actually is.
And Mike, also, I think the capstone thing is so huge that it would really devastate people to see how well coordinated this is and has been for so many decades.
Oh, Sophia, with everything. This is the problem we have in general. People cannot fathom the extent of the control. Full spectrum dominance. Some people will say they're not there yet. Others will say they have it. But that's what troubles people the most. Fear takes over when you start to explain this, that they have their hands in everything.
Yeah.
Everything. And that makes a lot of people very, very nervous. No doubt.
So there is another half of my newsletter, which nobody seems to care about.
Is it about the Holy Grail?
Well, the Holy Grail is only the literary bait that I've wrapped around this. But it's Clifford Carnicom's finding.
Yes. So Clifford, I used to follow Clifford's work going back years ago. I have to admit that I haven't looked at it in a while, but I was going back to the days when he was looking into morgelons.
Yes. Well, this is where it all starts, and this is the connection. Yeah. So in 2010, Clifford was already very experienced in looking in microscopy to the level that he could afford certain kinds of microscopes. And he had started in the late 90s to collect environmental fallout because he was looking up in the sky just like everybody else doesn't do. And he was seeing that planes are leaving lines and lines are becoming haze. And what's this? So he collected some atmospheric fallout in the hills of New Mexico and started to look at it under the microscope, and he found 3 classes of materials. He found these filaments, he found metallic salts, and he found a biological thingamabob, which somebody else who was also who was degreed, he was an MD, told Clifford that this is a dried red blood cell, and it's falling out of the sky, and it's a human. Desiccated means dried, have been artificially dried. So what's raining on us are these filaments and these blood cells. Anyway, the metallic oxides, aluminum oxide, all of these, some of them were heavy metals, titanium, barium oxide. They are poisoning the environment. But Clifford really, really, really started to focus on something that he called a new set of organisms, which were actually contained in those filaments. He could see inside those filaments with certain kinds of microscopy. And this blood cell, was in these filaments. And there was also something else. There was this little dot, less than a micron in size. A micron is a millionth of a meter. And he published a paper, I think this was 2014, that he had found a living entity like a bacterium that was half a micron in size. And he called it cross-domain bacteria, and he titled his paper, The New Biology. There is a new biological form on the earth that has penetrated everything. Mike, does anyone care?
Most people don't care.
No.
It's beyond their scope of comprehension as they go about their lives doing whatever it is they do. And I agree. When I got to this part of the newsletter, I found this to be probably the most important part
Yes.
of the newsletter, because this is something that you and I have known about and talked about.
That's right. And yet people are happy enough to talk about the weather modification, the geoengineering of the spraying, but they don't want to delve into this bioengineering aspect of it, which Clifford feels overrides the weather aspect. I mean, we have more direct experience with modified weather. I mean, now we've got thunderstorms in San Diego. When I first moved here decades ago, we didn't have thunderstorms. They were a thing that you got on the East Coast. From where I came. But now we've got thunderstorms, lightning, and the stuff will bang and crash right above the house forever. And I know this is artificially created to scare the crap out of us, number one.
It's interesting because I have said for a long time that it wasn't just weather modification that they were doing with the the aerosol spraying program, the geoengineering, you're right. I mean, the one-dimensional view of the geoengineering program was to alter the weather. But like anything they do, Sophia, and I know you know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, their tactics are multifaceted. It's never just one thing that they're going to cover. If they can cover multiple fronts, then they will do that.
And what Clifford is trying to make known still since 2014, he's trying to make known to the world that there is a new form of biology that has taken up residence on Earth, and it has penetrated everything. It is a new microbiology. And he says that this microbiology generates a spectrum of non-native metabolic growth in the organism it inhabits. That means, translation, it changes whatever it's in.
Which includes humans, animals, and plants, right?
Yes, the host. And the most extreme examples are the morgelons people. So we've got what's in them is in us. It's in us. And he says that these filaments, they are science, they are machines, they make these units. This bacteria-like structure is manufactured in this filament. Or it's the other way around. The bacteria-like structure is making the filament around it. I don't know which. And he looked at human blood, and he found this in everybody. Every blood sample he got, everybody's got this, whether they're sick or not. So now we have a novel, meaning brand new, unseen before in our world. There is a novel microorganism that has been introduced, and it's introducing a new biology into the world.
And Clifford did say, as you quoted him in a newsletter, that he was unable to kill or to destroy this biological entity, right?
Yeah, and here's where this dovetails with what they're finding. So I wrote a newsletter about life kingdoms. Super kingdoms, 3 of them. Life is the biggest kingdom. And then there are super kingdoms underneath that. Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. These things that he has found have appearances of all 3. So they cannot fall within conventional super kingdom classification. So these things, these materials, these organisms he's found have an extremely broad genetic diversity. And he brought to a laboratory some of this material that he had cultured, which means grown in a petri dish, because he's managed to reproduce this NMO thing. And the lab told him, they refused his sample, and they told him that they were unable to process his request.
I think they said they don't look at unsolicited.
That was the environmental EPA.
Okay.
They said they don't look at anything unless they want to, and they don't have an obligation to accept samples from unsolicited samples from Joe Schmo and analyze them. Great, right? So Joe Schmo educated himself. Clifford Carnicom bought textbook after textbook. He learned how to extract DNA. This is pretty amazing. That doesn't mean he can read. He can't sequence the DNA, but he's extracted it. And if you read my newsletter, you know that that is possible. You just have to filter and go through a lot of different stages working the material, and then you'll eventually get a sludge out of it that has its DNA in it. But you got to have equipment. You have to have, very sophisticated equipment to read DNA. But it's very sad. I'm going to quote him. I listened to a bunch of talks, and he says that this microorganism can develop inside us very, very easily. All of our body fluids contain it. Autopsies, now I learned this from the morgelons people, autopsies and surgeries reveal networks of these filaments in the body. I mean, literally like fuzz in somebody's knee. I know that person personally. In her knee, she had knee surgery, and the surgeon said, "What's this?" And there was this glut of filaments in her knee joint. So he says, Clifford, any plant he pulls from the woods and looks at under the microscope has this. And then his direct quote is, "I see this in everything that I look at. In anything you wish to look at, I can produce it. A microbiology of which there is no historical record that has made its presence on this planet, and I don't believe the public was ever intended to know that which we are speaking of." And to get back to this Holy Grail thing, I heard him say in one of his talks that these red blood cells that he can reproduce by culturing, and they're made in the filament. They appear. You can see on all his slides. Go to carnicominstitute.org and look at the slides, and you'll see these tubular filaments that have these red blood cells in them. So he said, okay, I placed human blood in the culture medium, and I studied these cultures. A very, very unusual form of growth took place. I know how much blood I put into the culture, and what happened was, I had a growth process that was taking place. The volume of production, you don't grow blood cells in a test tube, not by any conventional measure. This would be what I call a holy grail of biology. So our blood is made in our bone marrow, inside the body. If you put blood anywhere outside the body, it's not going to make more of itself. That's the holy grail that he's talking about. And what does sangreal mean? Blood.
Right. And I believe in your newsletter, Clifford was saying that it's self-replicating, right?
Yes, it makes more of itself.
Right.
It's not in the bone marrow. It's not happening in the interior of your bones. It's happening in a test tube. So this is heavy.
It is heavy stuff. And again, as you mentioned before, trying to get people to get their heads wrapped around it.
This is another Dybbuk. This self-replicating novel microorganism and the blood cells that accompany it. You know, he said, Clifford, there is a very sophisticated level of design and intelligence behind these findings. Yet, the only people that go to his website, except for a few conspiracy theorists like us, are the Air Force people, the government, corporations, hospitals, media. He said, in 1999, only a short time, and I'm talking weeks, days or weeks after he had posted, he, as some fellow out there, posted photos of these unusual quote-unquote contrails on the internet. Dozens of these heavyweights visited his webpage from nowhere.
Yeah, so, and by the way, we are conspiracy analysts.
Yes, I know. I can call it theorists if we want.
Teasing.
Yes.